Hi, this is Chris, and we are in section 4 of SAT Practice Test 1, taking a look at these grid-in questions. Here we're on question 35. It shows this figure of a cylinder and reads, a dairy farmer uses a storage silo that is in the shape of the right circular cylinder above. If the volume of the silo is 72 pi cubic yards, what is the diameter of the base of the cylinder in yards? So they give us a value for volume. They tell us that the volume of the silo is 72 pi, and they tell us the shape. We should be able to recognize that this is a cylinder, but they do tell us it's a right circular cylinder. And so if we look at our formula for volume of a cylinder, that formula is pi r squared h. Now, if you don't know that formula, it is worth memorizing just because it'll show up, and they do give you a little cheat sheet at the beginning of the math section that has a couple of these geometric formulas for volume and area. But if we're looking to score 600 plus in the math, then realistically, those are formulas that we should memorize. We should memorize them for two reasons. One is that if you have it memorized, you're more likely to be able to apply the information in a question to that formula correctly because you understand the formula better, you understand what the variables represent and so forth. And B, just from a time-saving standpoint, on any standardized test, time is always going to be really important to keep an eye on, and anytime you can save yourself those few seconds from having to go look something up, then that's going to make you a more efficient test taker. So we should know this formula, and then here we can plug in, they give us 8 yards for our height. They tell us 72 pi cubic yards for the volume, and we can use that to solve for the missing variable to solve for r. So we would plug in here 72 pi equals pi r squared. Let me make that pi look a little nicer. Pi r squared times our height of 8. And then to do the math on this, the pi's cancel. You can divide both sides by 8, so 9 equals r squared. And 3 equals r. Now, be very, very, very careful of what they're asking for. They even underline it for you, which is they're asking for the diameter of the base of the cylinder in yards. And what we solved for is the radius of 3. And if you know the radius, the diameter is just double the radius, which means our correct answer here would be 6. That's what we want to grid in. But I can't tell you how often I see students on this question who apply the correct formula, they plug everything in the right place, they do the correct math, they get 3 for the radius, and then they bubble in 3 on their answer sheet as opposed to just double checking what the question's asking. So you don't want to take the time to do a question correctly and then miss it for a silly reason like that. Just make sure you're double, triple checking what the question is actually asking for so that you're bubbling in the right value. Now on question 36, here we have a function h of x is equal to 1 over x minus 5 quantity squared plus 4 times x minus 5 plus 4. They want to know for what value of x is the function h above undefined. So the key word here is undefined. For a fraction to be undefined, that would mean that you have a 0 in the denominator. So really what they're asking here is what value of x would make this denominator, and I'm just going to rewrite the denominator here, equal to 0. So let's see if we can try to solve this. And there's a couple ways that you could try to factor this out, but I think the easiest way, and probably the way that I see most students inclined to do this question, is to go ahead and just FOIL out this x minus 5 term at the beginning. So you're going to do x minus 5 times x minus 5, and then you can distribute your 4. That would be, when you distribute to both parts, that would be 4x minus 20, and then plus 4 on the end. And here we can use FOIL first, outside, inside, last, and plus 4x. Negative 20 plus 4 is going to be negative 16. So I'm just sort of cleaning that up a little bit there. and we can combine like terms. We get x squared, negative 5 and negative 5 would be negative 10x, plus 4x would be a minus 6x, and then a positive 25 minus 16 would be positive 9. And then here we can factor this out, and this is actually going to be x minus 3 times x minus 3, giving us a solution of x equals 3 for this question. Now in this step here, if you aren't comfortable factoring something like this out, that's a really important skill for the test. So we're not going to go through the basics of that skill, but you can check out one of our other videos on skill building where we cover how to factor out a quadratic or how to factor out a polynomial. And you'll see a variety of different kinds where you have maybe a difference of squares, or you have, let's say, something with 4 terms where you have to use some grouping, or you have something that in this case is a perfect squared trinomial that factors into 2 of the exact same factors. So there's a varied level of difficulty that you want to get exposure to and just make sure you're comfortable with in order to do that factoring piece. But on this question, the most important thing conceptually is understanding that for a fraction to be undefined, you're going to set that denominator equal to 0 like we did in that first step. Let's take a look now at question number 37. So again, we know that the grid-ins go easy to hard, so as we get to 37, 38, these should be pretty difficult. And let's see if we can tackle these. So it says Jessica opened a bank account that earns 2% interest compounded annually. Her initial deposit was $100, and she uses the expression 100 times x to the t to find the value of the account after t years. So 37 asks us, what is the value of x in the expression? And this is a concept that we try to revisit as frequently as possible and emphasize because it's going to show up. But when you have a percent change, in this case it's earning 2% interest, remember that your percent changes are always based off of 100%. So to find your new amount after that percent change, you want to either add or subtract from 100. So if it were something, let's say like a store with a sale that had a 15% discount, so if it were 15% off, you would subtract 15 from 100%. In this case, it's earning 2% interest. That means you're adding, right? You're gaining value here. So you're adding that percent on to 100. So whatever your original amount is, which is the $100, you're going to add this 2% to 100%. Your new amount now, after that first year, is going to be 102% of your original starting amount. Or another way of phrasing that is that you'd be multiplying the decimal form of that, which is 1.02. And then the exponent, the t here, is because this is compounding annually, which basically just means that you're going to be adding that 2% every year, year over year over year. So you'd be multiplying times 1.02 for the first year, and then times 1.02 again, times 1.02 again, times 1.02 again. So that's why you have this exponent of t, because however many years it's compounding, that's going to be how many times you're multiplying by 1.02. But if we set that equation up, then we can see here that the x value that they're asking for in that equation is just 1.02, and that's because, and I'll just put this part in red, you're earning 2% interest, which means you're adding that value to your starting percent, which is always based off of 100. So for any percent change, if you're looking for that new amount or that resulting amount, just make sure that you're taking whatever that percent change is and you're adding or subtracting it with 100 to get the percent form of your new amount. And when you plug it in to do the calculation, you're going to plug it in its decimal form for these kinds of questions. Now let's take a look at 38, because if we have that equation correct, this is actually going to be really helpful on this last question. It says Jessica's friend Tyshawn found an account that earns 2.5% interest compounded annually. Tyshawn made an initial deposit of $100 into this account. At the same time, Jessica made a deposit of $100 into her account. After 10 years, how much more money will Tyshawn's initial deposit have earned than Jessica's initial deposit? Round your answer to the nearest cent, which means 2 decimal places. Okay, so we have to use, this equation was Jessica's that we had up here. So this is her initial amount of 100 times 1.02, and it's to the t. In this case, let's see what we would plug in for t here, because they give us an amount of time in this question. It says after 10 years, which basically, this is just another way of letting us know that t equals 10. So here we would have, for Jessica, we would have 100 times 1.02 to the 10th power. And if we do the math on that, 1.02 to the 10th times 100 will give us 121.90. So that's the amount that Jessica has. And then her friend Tyshawn has an account that earns a little bit more interest. So it's going to be a similar equation, except instead of just adding the 2% to 100, we're adding 2.5. So it's still the same starting amount, but this would be 102.5, or 1 point in decimal form 025 to the 10th for Tyshawn. And just to write out why that is, remember, for any percent change, to figure out his new amount, you're adding that 2.5% to 100, which is giving us 102.5%. And as a decimal, when you go to plug in decimal form, it looks like 1.025 to the 10th power. So he's earning a little bit more interest here. And if we do that calculation, we do 1.025 to the 10th, and then multiply that by 100 to get 128.01. So now let's double check what the question's asking. They want to know in this question how much more money Tyshawn has than Jessica's. So they both started with the same amount. So they're looking at how much they've earned. So here he has earned his $28.01. After that span of time, she has earned $21.90 after that span of time. And if you subtract these values, this part you could probably do in your head, but it is calculator section, so you're welcome to use calculator for this, and depending on how you're doing on time, it's always helpful to double check, but that gives you 611 as the difference in what they've earned after this 10-year span of time. So for this is really, question 38 is just an expansion of what we already looked at in 37, and the concept here is just making sure that we understand this piece of the question about what's happening when you have a percent change. That percent change is always relative to 100%. Stay tuned and check out our additional videos as we get into SAT